Okay, now don't forget that tomorrow you're out, so enjoy your time off. And then Thursday, we have the reading quiz on Chapter 8, and the test is Friday. So we're going to be finishing up everything on Thursday and starting to review. We can review a little bit for the test on Friday if we need to. So we'll be splitting the review between those 2 days. So that's what's coming up. So today we're continuing to look at 19th century reforms, particularly how some of these reforms involved a large number of women and how women themselves become wrapped up into reform movements and start then not only to find ways to be involved in abolition and other kinds of things, but how that will also soon lead them to start seeking a greater position, more rights and such for themselves. And so we will see women's rights become part of the conversation surrounding reform movements, political movements of the time. All devices away, please. Phones away. Phones away. So first, let's talk a little bit about women and their, perceived roles, perceived agendas, perceived place, as it were, in the 19th century during this time, and also how that was changing. What was kind of considered to be the traditional women's role, and how many 19th century women embraced that, but also started to seek more opportunities and more freedoms and more legal rights and those kinds of things. So generally speaking, we pretty much know at least a very basic, almost kind of cliched version of it. But what do we kind of know or already understand about women's roles during the 19th century? Housewives. What else comes to mind? Yes? Looking after children, being in the home, not doing what kind of things? Yeah, not going out into the workforce, being in the home. Absolutely, teaching the children, raising the children to be good citizens. We're going to talk about the name of that here in just a moment. So that kind of a cliche thing was the truth for a lot of people. But legally, of course, we know that women had very few, if any, rights at all. That 19th century women, they were banned from most kind of professions. Most women, did not have professional careers, hardly any did. Higher education was not something that was open to women. Any kind of education, of course, was only going to be open to upper class women, but then it was going to be, private education. College was simply not an option for most women at all. There weren't many colleges that would accept women, and there certainly weren't any opportunities for women beyond that. Certainly no legal rights. There were no states in which women could vote. There were, in many states, women could not even own property, could not inherit property, really have the legal status of a minor, not being considered full citizens, not being able to enter into any kind of agreement or a contract or initiate any kind of a legal proceeding because they did not have any legal status. And again, that would have varied a little bit from state to state. But for the most part, women have the legal status of, an underage person. And again, the role of women, though, was defined as, not you're subservient, you don't have any rights or anything. Women were, told, and the, societal norm was that women did have a very specific and very important purpose. That could be described, or one of the ways that was described, a traditional role of women in this time was this concept of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood, and this is a concept that developed probably around the time of the American Revolution and then continues to be the accepted kind of understanding of what a woman's role was. Republican motherhood argued that a woman's role was to be, the civilizing force in her home. That it was a woman's job to raise her children. This is what David began a second ago. To raise her children to have, certain values, to raise her children and to raise her family to be good citizens, to instill in them the qualities that would make them good citizens of the United States, good citizens of America, good citizens of a Republican society, of a republic. Thus the name Republican Motherhood. Arguing that for a republic to really function well, citizens have to be civic-minded. They need to be responsible, honest. You need to have basic skills like reading and writing, of course, for most folks, that sort of thing. But they need to be people of good character, be people of good morals, be upstanding people in society. So Republican motherhood, argues that a woman's job is crucial in a democracy. It's crucial in a republic. But their job is not to be the voter. Their job is not to be the office holder. Their job is not to be the political leader, but that they are kind of where things start in the home, and then they are raising the next generation of good voters for their sons, and the next generation of good mothers for their daughters, so that they will then pass on these ideas and these kind of things. So it's an attempt to give dignity and importance to that sort of homemaker kind of role. So it wasn't always portrayed as just, like women were servants, even though many of them may have felt that way. It does try to put an importance and a really patriotic almost aspect to women's work. Teach the children and the family these consistent values, so we will have a strong democracy where people work hard and they're not selfish and they do what is best for the country. However, and this idea doesn't go away, but we see it kind of being built upon, and kind of even this next bit is very, very similar to Republican motherhood. They're not conflicting ideas. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that we talked about just a moment ago, this sort of assumed idea that a woman's place was in the home, that women were the homemakers, women looked after the women and the children and the home, and it was their job not to go out and be the breadwinner and all of that. And that really was true. But really and truly, the whole idea that a woman's place was in the home and the man's place was where? At work, in the workplace, going out and earning the money. That really was kind of a mid-19th century idea. Gender roles were changing a little bit in the United States as a result of industrialization. Industrialization brings about that image that we all just talked about. We tend to assume that things had always been that way, and it kind of was. But not as defined, not as nice and neat, not as specifically categorized as we just did it. Industrialization was changing gender roles. It was really creating more of what would be called, or considered separate spheres. The home sphere, and that the home is where women dominate, and the work sphere. That's because industrialization means that for the first time, the workplace isn't in the home. Prior to industrialization, for most people, this wasn't true of everybody, but for most people, home was where they worked. They worked on their farm. They did their work in their home. But even if that was a business, they probably lived in the same place. So there was not near as much of a separation of the home and work. And particularly if you're talking about like a small farm, the tasks were more shared. Women, while yes, they did more of the cooking and cleaning and all that, but they were out in the field too. They were doing some of that stuff too. Those kind of different jobs were a bit more shared. So it is truly industrialization that starts to create that concept that the workplace is the man's world and the home is the woman's world. And that women should not only be in the home, but that the home was kind of the place of, to get away from work. That the home was the place to rejuvenate. The home was the place to relax. The home was the place to be comfortable. And that the home should be a comfortable environment for the family and all of that. So all of that real strict definition is really happening more in the mid-19th century, and partially as a result of industrialization. Even childhood is being redefined by that. It's not just men's roles and women's roles. If you think about this, it's not true in all cases, but if you think about portraits or pictures, paintings, of course, because it's before photography, of children, before all of this, they always looked like little adults. They dressed them like adults. They did a lot of adult work. Little girls taught from, the time they can walk to iron and clean and sew and all that kind of stuff. They treated them like adults. Industrialization starts to create more of this concept of childhood being a time of play, and that children should be able to enjoy themselves as well as learn things. But it wasn't just about being a small adult. Yes.
In some paintings, they were actually paintings like little adults.
Yeah, even sometimes not just the clothes, but just they look like
they were literally tiny.
Yeah, that's kind of how people saw it, and not so much a time of imagination and encouraging that kind of stuff. So industrialization has changed a lot of that. And so that then creates, and this is very, very similar to Republican motherhood, so don't get the idea that they're different ideas. They really are quite similar. It's more like, let me explain it first, and I think you'll see what I mean. So this whole separation of the woman's sphere, the man's sphere, the home being the place of relaxation, the home being this domesticated kind of thing, creates this concept that becomes called the cult of domesticity. It's kind of a strange looking phrase. Domesticity coming from what? Domestic. What's domestic mean? The home, okay? The cult of domesticity, similar to Republican motherhood, it glorifies a woman's role in the home. It glorifies this concept that a woman's place was in the home and making a strong, comfortable home for her family. So it just like Republican motherhood suggests that was a virtuous thing for women to do. The cult of domesticity does the same, but there's a bit more emphasis on femininity in the cult of domesticity. That this is what a true woman does. That women should be pure. They should be feminine. They should be creating a space in the home where their husband, their children would be comfortable. They could relax. The home should be, nicely kept. It should be neat and clean. That there should be nice furniture and nice paintings and all these kind of things to make it more of a haven, a relaxation, all that. So with all those ideas, as you can guess, the cult of domesticity really only applies. You're talking about really upper middle class to wealthy people. This would not have been the case for lower to middle class women. Many of them probably are having to work outside the home or in the field. So this is certainly a class thing as well, and would not have applied to women of all socioeconomic statuses. But the cult of domesticity, like this image right here, you can see it is glorifying this idea of seeing the woman there, that everybody looks really nice. The home looks very nice and neat and clean. There's all kind of nice things in it. See the children nicely dressed, playing on the floor with the animals there. That this is glorifying. This is an example of this idea of the cult of domesticity. So the home is a refuge from the outside world and all of that. So many women found this as part of their role and relished in that and saw that as really important. But some women still, of course, found that constricting. And that also gives a lot of women, particularly those of upper class, higher class with more education, kind of see some emptiness in that, and also wanting to seeing that they had a role, that they had a job, or they had a responsibility rather, to speak for people that couldn't speak for themselves, that they in their privilege should use that status and use that privilege to bring about change. So many of these women, usually you're talking upper to middle class women at this time. I've already mentioned before, a lot of them were involved in a lot of these reform movements. At the Second Great Awakening, in many cases, truly inspired a lot of women. The Second Great Awakening, with its messages of equality, with its messages of all are equal before God, with its messages that anybody can obtain salvation and God calls people equally, that really resonated with a lot of women. And so a lot of women found themselves inspired to go around and find the things in society that were unwholesome, to find the things that were morally wrong, and to attack those things and try to fix them. Many women even feeling like perhaps that as women, they may have been better suited to do a lot of those things. That as women and being nurturers, being caring, being motherly, that they might better recognize certain problems that men wouldn't notice, and they might be able to find better solutions to those things. So we've already seen that. That's not a new concept. For example, we saw Dorothea Dix and all of that. So there were lots of women involved in many of these reform movements. Another reform movement that really involved a great deal of women, it's not only women, but it included an enormous amount of women, and probably would not have gotten as far as it did without women, was temperance. Temperance, which is a movement that we'll see come up a couple times afterwards again, temperance was the movement to ban or to limit alcohol. So temperance is an anti-alcohol movement. And it actually may be one of the more widespread of all of the reform movements of this time. It may be one of the ones that was the most somewhat accepted all over the country, or not accepted because it's not totally successful, but where you would have seen it, it would have had a presence in more parts of the country, rather than something like abolition that would have been, really confined to the North, and even still then quite a minority movement. Temperance might have been a bit more widespread. So temperance reformers, many of them women, argued that a lot or almost all of society's problems were rooted in alcohol, and that it was excessive drinking that was causing so many problems that were devastating to society. For example, they would have said that, crime, people that commit are criminals, people that are not doing a good job at work and becoming unemployed and then becoming homeless, and then there's disease. They trace all these things back to alcohol. And some of that may have also, there's a lot of immigration taking place in this period, and that probably contributed to it. Cultural differences of influx of immigrants that just happen to drink more. But temperance advocates believed that if you got rid of alcohol, or you encourage people not to drink, that a lot of those problems would go away. And women also felt, one of the reasons why this includes so many women, that it was women that really bore the brunt of that it was women and the family and the home that suffered when people drank too much. And there were many women that, were being left poverty-stricken and alone and having to fend for themselves because their husband was drinking all the time or something like that. So they traced any kind of problems from poverty, disease, low productivity, any of that stuff to alcohol use. And this is also related to the Second Great Awakening still. They saw this as an unchristian activity, that people needed to live sinful and people needed to live blameless lives and needed to repent and reform. Again, that's always one of the themes of a lot of these reform movements, is this idea that anybody can make a pledge, and anybody can turn their life around, anybody can be saved. So temperance advocates would be working to, sometimes it's getting states or local governments to ban alcohol or to limit it. Sometimes it's just individual things, trying to get people to swear off of drinking, sign these pledges, and a lot of it is distributing pamphlets and things like that. And temperance, again, it doesn't go away after the mid-19th century. We'll see it pop back up again a little bit later. But temperance, like a lot of things, eventually has to kind of take a back seat to particularly abolition. Now, abolition, we've already discussed, but I just want to make the connection between abolition and women. Because abolition was the movement to do what? In slavery. So we've already talked about that. Well, what I want to talk about here is the relationship between abolition and female reformers. Many abolitionists were women. The abolition movement always included a large number of women. You saw that on the video that we watched. And it is actually from abolition, as well as a few other reforms, but probably more abolition than anything else, that really causes a lot of women to start questioning their own situation and to start questioning their own legal status. Because many women, as they get involved with abolition, found themselves still quite limited in that, found themselves not accepted amongst their colleagues, amongst male abolitionists that said, no, women shouldn't be participating in this, or women shouldn't be speaking in front of men, all this sort of thing. And that caused a lot of those women to say, hey, we've got just as much of a right to do that as well. And then they start thinking, ultimately the real power is having the power to make law and the power to vote. And if we had those things, think of the other kind of changes that we could bring. And if we're trying to speak out and be a voice for people that don't have a voice, neither do we really in some ways, because we can't vote and all that sort of thing. We're not considered, don't have any kind of legal authority even over ourselves. And so it is really out of the abolition movement that you will see the birth of the women's rights movement. In fact, some of the very first women's rights activists were also abolitionists. That also causes some tension. There were also movements to improve education for women. We talked about education, public education, Horace Mann, and all that, and how that was part of the reforms of these days. But for some women, they insisted and demanded better educational opportunities for women, since higher education in particular was something that just was not an option for most women. Emma Willard and Mary Lyon were both reformers for women's education. They started some of the first women's colleges that would admit women. Now, granted, those would have been, of course, only available to upper class women. This is not something that would have affected your, lower class kind of people. And the thing is, there were some women's, like I said, educational opportunities would have only been available to the wealthy. But then, it was private education, and it was generally centered around the domestic arts, cult of domesticity. It was learning how to, even for upper class women, how to do pretty embroidery and how to play the piano and sing and things that are going to catch you a husband and all that sort of stuff, and how to write pretty letters and that sort of stuff. It wasn't studying science and math and literature and stuff like that. So Emma Willard and Mary Lyon wanted to establish schools and colleges that would allow women to pursue academic subjects, not just things that were going to help them make a comfortable home and be an attractive society wife, but things that they might actually possibly make a career out of, although many of them are not able to do that, but to pursue those academic studies, languages, and astronomy, and different things like that. Question? Okay. So again, all of this involvement of women in so many of these reform movements, and particularly of abolition. The women's rights movement is really kind of born out of the abolition movement. Particularly, there was an instance in which some of women that they were gathering, I want to say it was in New York, but I don't know if that's right, for some sort of abolitionist meeting or convention. And some of the men there were so offended that women wanted to participate. They told them to leave. And these women refused to leave, and eventually they came to an agreement that they could stay and listen to the speeches and listen to the presentations, but they had to sit behind a curtain so that nobody could see them. And that led to some of these women saying, we deserve to be able to speak out. We deserve to have the right to change things the way that we will want to change them, and we should have more of a voice in these sorts of things. So that leads to, by the 1840s, some women coming together to start defining their own movement for greater rights. Now, these three women are some of the first major women's rights activists. You probably have heard some of these names. Again, many of them actually were affiliated with abolition, first of all, but then decide to turn their attention toward greater rights for women. So some of these first leading women's rights activists included Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So in 1848, several of these women decide to organize a convention, a meeting, where they will invite other like-minded women and men, where there were some men that did support this and felt that women should be allowed more rights and were supportive of their efforts. And so in 1848, they organized that meeting called the Seneca Falls Convention. So the Seneca Falls Convention, this is a women's rights convention, sort of like, almost like a kickoff event for women's rights, where different activists, they're kind of coming together to sort of define their movement and define their goals and not just to be encouraged and to listen to people talk and have speeches and all that kind of thing and sort of get inspired and sort of make a plan of what they were working for, but just sort of define, this is who we are, this is what we want, these are our goals that we want to see accomplished. And obviously there was a lot of disagreement about that because people were all over the spectrum as far as how much they thought women ought to be working for and how many rights, what kind of rights, what specific things should women be demanding, what was appropriate and what wasn't. And after many days of having those discussions, listening to speeches, having arguments and all of that, at the Seneca Falls Convention, the delegates wrote, and many of them signed, something that became called the Declaration of Sentiments. So this was the document that they wrote, sort of their manifesto, that they write at the Seneca Falls Convention. So the Declaration of Sentiments, first of all, what does that even kind of sound like a little bit? Declaration of Independence, and it is based on it. They use the Declaration of Independence kind of as their starting point. And they use the same logic, the same arguments, and even the same kind of wording. They started it really kind of taking from the Declaration of Independence, but changing it to be gender inclusive, to say that not only are all men created equal, but what? All men and women are created equal. But using that same logic to say government should represent the people, and government gets its power from the consent of the governed, and we are half of the governed, and yet we're not getting consent. So using that same argument, kind of turning that argument on itself to suggest why women were legally entitled to more rights. And if this is a country that truly believes that power comes from the people, well, here's half of us that aren't really being represented in any of this. And as well as doing all of that and basing their arguments on that American rhetoric, they also kind of go through and talk about the ways that women are oppressed and the rights that they want, the kind of things that they want to see change, the kind of things that they want to see happen. What kind of rights do you think they included in this that they wanted? Right to vote, right to own property, right for, to be open to certain kinds of employment, because all that, there weren't a whole lot of professional careers that were available to women, but big things were property rights, other just basic legal rights. There were plenty of states where, women, men could initiate things like divorce, but women could not, where women did not have control, even custody of children if or legal rights over their children if their husband had died or something, where they could not inherit property, those sorts of things. So they are demanding, greater educational opportunities, but basic legal and political rights. And what's interesting here is that usually when we say, okay, what kind of rights do they want? Almost always the first thing people say is the right to vote. We think of that as being like front and center, the number one thing they would have wanted, but actually that almost did not make it in the Declaration of Sentiments. That was one of the very controversial things that a lot of these even very reform-minded women that came to this convention were shocked and appalled in some cases when I think it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton that brought it up and said we should be looking for the right to vote. So even then, amongst reform-minded people, that was considered pretty radical for women to demand the vote. And it causes a lot of friction. The women's rights movement kind of struggles. It struggles for a long time, but one of the reasons why is this friction between those that kind of felt things like voting rights and such was too far, or something they needed to work for the smaller things first and all of that. As far as the success of women's rights at this time, there are some gains, but not very many. There are some states that may start to allow women to own property or at least to inherit it, that if their husband died or something, they can at least inherit the property, if not own it outright by themselves. We said that there were some more educational opportunities that were being open to some women. Western states are typically always going to be a little bit more open to women's rights, and that will continue on throughout the 19th century, and it will be later on the Western states will be the first ones to allow women to vote, but not for quite some time. So there are some gains, some increased property rights and all of that, but for the most part, women will have to wait a long time for a lot of those things that they outline. However, some of the women there would live to see some of those gains made. Unfortunately for women's rights and for a lot of these other reform movements, this is in 1848. And by the time we get to the 1850s, the national conversation is just changing. And by that time, the women's movement, along with temperance, along with prison reform, the utopias, all of that is soon going to be overshadowed, is soon going to be eclipsed by abolition. The abolition movement and the slavery question to go along with it, probably bigger than the slavery question. By the time we get to the 1850s, for certain reasons, that is going to be the thing that cannot be ignored. And so women's rights will take a back seat to that. But once, after the Civil War, and by the late 19th century, and certainly the dawn of the 20th century, with abolition having been somewhat settled, then we will see a lot of these movements, of course, women's rights and temperance being another one, and a lot of those come back and have a resurgence and continue to work evens and out. So, all right. Any questions about all